Misotheism, Wikipedia audio. Misotheism is the hatred of God or hatred of the gods. In some varieties of polytheism, it was considered possible to inflict punishment on gods by ceasing to worship them. Thus, Hrafnkel, protagonist of the eponymous Hrafnkel saga set in the 10th century, as his temple to Freyr is burnt and he is enslaved, states that I think it is folly to have faith in gods, never performing another blot, a position described in the sagas as golos, godless. Jacob Grimm in his Teutonic mythology observes that it is remarkable that Old Norse legend occasionally mentions certain men who, turning away in utter disgust and doubt from the heathen faith, placed their reliance on their own strength and virtue. Thus in the Solar Lio 17 we read of Vibhaji and Radi Aishulfsig au true, in themselves they trusted. In monotheism, the sentiment arises in the context of theodicy. A famous literary expression of misotheistic sentiment is Goethe's Prometheus, composed in the 1770s. Terminology. A related concept is dystheism, the belief that a god is not wholly good, and is possibly evil. Trickster gods found in polytheistic belief systems often have a dystheistic nature. One example is Eshu, a trickster god from Yoruba religion who deliberately fostered violence between groups of people for his own amusement, saying that causing strife is my greatest joy. The concept of the demiurge in some versions of ancient Gnosticism also often portrayed the demiurge as a generally evil entity. Goethe's Prometheus, the work of the Marquis de Sade, Emily Dickinson's poem apparently with no surprise depicts God as approving of suffering in the world, relating the tale of a flower beheaded by a late frost as the sun measure off another day for an approving God. Mark Twain argued against what he saw as the petty God many followed in a posthumously published book, The Bible According to Mark Twain, Writings on Heaven, Eden, and the Flood. He talks, in part, about the African sleeping sickness, malaria. Ivan Karamazov in Fyodor Dostoevsky's 1879. The brothers Karamazov articulates what might be termed a dystheistic rejection of God. Koons covered this argument in the lecture immediately following the one referenced above. It was also discussed by Peter S. Foslow in his essay titled The Moral Imperative to Rebel Against God. Conrad, the protagonist of Adam Mickiewicz' Forefathers Eve, calls God a tsar. Many polytheistic deities since prehistoric times have been assumed to be neither good nor evil. Thus dystheism is normally used in reference to the Judeo-Christian God. In conceptions of God as the summum bonum, the proposition of God not being wholly good would be an oxymoron. A historical proposition close to dystheism is the Deus Deceptor evil demon of René Descartes' Meditations on First Philosophy, which has been interpreted by Protestant critics as the blasphemous proposition that God exhibits malevolent intent. But Richard Kennington states that Descartes never declared his evil genius to be omnipotent, but merely no less powerful than he is deceitful, and thus not explicitly an equivalent to God, the singular omnipotent deity. Dystheistic speculation arises from consideration of the problem of evil, the question of why God, who is supposedly omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent, would allow evil to exist in the world. Koons notes that this is only a theological problem for a eutheist, since a dystheist would not find the existence of evil to be an obstacle to theistic belief. In fact, the dystheistic option would be a consistent non-contradictory response to the problem of evil. Thus Koons concludes that the problem of theodicy does not pose a challenge to all possible forms of theism. This conclusion implicitly takes the first horn of the Euthyphro dilemma, asserting the independence of good and evil morality from God. Historically, the notion of good as an absolute concept has emerged in parallel with the notion of God being the singular entity identified with good. In this sense, Distheism amounts to the abandonment of a central feature of historical monotheism, the de facto association of God with the summum bonum. Arthur Schopenhauer wrote, "This world could not have been the work of an all-loving being, but that of a devil, who had brought creatures into existence in order to delight in the sight of their sufferings." Critics of Calvin's doctrines of predestination frequently argued that Calvin's doctrines did not successfully avoid describing God as the author of evil. Much of post-Holocaust theology, especially in Judaic theological circles, is devoted to a rethinking of God's goodness. Examples include the work of David R. Blumenthal, author of Facing the Abusing God, and John K. Roth, whose essay A Theodicy of Protest is included in Encountering Evil, Live Options in Theodicy. Theodicy. Everything hinges on the proposition that God possesses but fails to use well enough the power to intervene decisively at any moment to make history's course less wasteful. Thus, in spite and because of his sovereignty, this God is everlastingly guilty, and the degrees run from gross negligence to mass murder. To the extent that are born with the potential and power to, credit for that fact belongs elsewhere. Elsewhere is God's address. The deus deceptor, deceptive God, is a concept of Cartesianism. Fuidius accused Descartes of blasphemy in 1643. Jacques Triglandius and Jacobus Rivius, theologians at Leiden University, made similar accusations in 1647, accusing Descartes of hold God to be a deceiver, a position that they stated to be contrary to the glory of God. Descartes was threatened with having his views condemned by a synod, but this was prevented by the intercession of the Prince of Orange. The accusations referenced a passage in the first meditation where Descartes stated that he supposed not an optimal God but rather an evil demon, Summipotens and Calidus. The accusers identified Descartes' concept of a deus deceptor with his concept of an evil demon, stating that only an omnipotent God is Summipotens, and that describing the evil demon as such thus demonstrated the identity. Descartes' response to the accusations was that in that passage he had been expressly distinguishing between the supremely good God, the source of truth, on the one hand, and the malicious demon on the other. He did not directly rebut the charge of implying that the evil demon was omnipotent, but asserted that simply describing something with some attribute that in reality belongs only to God does not mean that that something is being held to actually be a supreme God. The evil demon is omnipotent, Christian doctrine notwithstanding, and is seen as a key requirement for Descartes' argument by Cartesian scholars such as Algy, Beck, Émile Brière, Chevalier, Frankfurt, Etienne Gilson, Anthony Kenny, Laporte, Kemp Smith, and Wilson. The progression through the first meditation, leading to the introduction of the concept of the evil genius at the end, is to introduce various categories into the set of dubitables, such as mathematics. Although the hypothetical evil genius is never stated to be one and the same as the hypothetical deus deceptor, the inference by the reader that they are is a natural one, and the requirement that the deceiver is capable of introducing deception even into mathematics is seen by commentators as a necessary part of Descartes' argument. Scholars contend that in fact Descartes was not introducing a new hypothetical, merely couching the idea of a deceptive God in terms that would not be offensive. Paul Erdos, the eccentric and extremely prolific Hungarian-born mathematician, referred to the notion of Deus Deceptor in a humorous context when he called God the supreme fascist, who deliberately hid things from people, ranging from socks and passports to the most elegant of mathematical proofs. A similar sentiment is expressed by Douglas Adams in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy in reference to the temptation of Adam and Eve by God. There are various examples of arguable distheism in the Bible, sometimes cited as arguments for atheism, most of them from the Pentateuch. A notable exception is the Book of Job, a classical case study of theodicy, which can be argued to consciously discuss the possibility of distheism. Thomas Paine wrote in The Age of Reason that whenever we read the obscene stories, the voluptuous debaucheries, the cruel and torturous executions, the unrelenting vindictiveness, with which more than half the Bible is filled, it would be more consistent that we called it the word of a demon than the word of God. But Paine's perspective was a deistic one, critical more of common beliefs about God than of God himself. Deus Deceptor. Scripture. The New Testament contains references to an evil god, specifically the prince of this world or god of this world who has blinded the minds of men. Mainstream Christian theology sees these as references to Satan, but Gnostics, Marcionites, and Manichaeans saw these as references to Yahweh himself. To God as wrathful or violent are more sparse in the New Testament than in the Old, but a number of anti-theist speakers, notably Hitchens and Matt Dillahunty, have drawn attention to a number of passages. Misotheism in art and literature. Poetry and drama. Modern literature. Speculative fiction. Popular music. Misotheistic and / or distheistic expression has a long history in the arts and in literature. Bernard Schweitzer's book Hating God, The Untold Story of Misotheism is devoted to this topic. He traces the history of ideas behind misotheism from the Book of Job, via Epicureanism and the twilight of Roman paganism, to deism, anarchism, Nietzschean philosophy, feminism, and radical humanism. The main literary figures in his study are Percy Bysshe Shelley, Algernon Swinburne, Zora Neale Hurston, Rebecca West, Elie Wiesel, Peter Schaeffer, and Philip Pullman. Schweitzer argues that literature is the preferred medium for the expression of God hatred because the creative possibilities of literature allow writers to simultaneously unburden themselves of their misotheism, while ingeniously veiling their blasphemy. Other examples include: in more recent times, the sentiment is present in a variety of media. Modern art. The characters in several of Tennessee Williams' plays express distheistic attitudes, including the Reverend T. Lawrence Shannon in The Night of the Iguana. Robert Frost's poem Design questions how God could have created death if he were benevolent. In Jewish author Elie Wiesel's play The Trial of God, the survivors of a pogrom, in which most of the inhabitants of a 17th-century Jewish village were massacred, put God on trial for his cruelty and indifference to their misery. The play is based on an actual trial Wiesel participated in that was conducted by inmates of the Auschwitz concentration camp during the Nazi Holocaust, but it also references a number of other incidents in Jewish history, including a similar trial conducted by the Hasidic Rabbi Levi Yosef Yitzhak of Berdichev. Men and women are being beaten, tortured, and killed. True, they are victims of men. But the killers kill in God's name. Not all. True, but let one killer kill for God's glory, and God is guilty. Every person who suffers or causes suffering, every woman who is raped, every child who is tormented implicates him. What? You need more. 100 or 1,000. Listen, either he is responsible or he is not. If he is, let's judge him. If he is not, let him stop judging us. Several non-Jewish authors share Wiesel's concerns about God's nature, including Salman Rushdie and Anne Provost. Why would you trust a God that doesn't give us the right book? Throughout history, he's given the Jewish people a book, he's given the Christians a book, and he's given the Muslims books, and there are big similarities between these books, but there are also contradictions. He needs to come back and create clarity and not, let us fight over who's right. He should make it clear. So, my personal answer to your question, should we trust? I wouldn't. The writing of Sir Kingsley Amis contains some misotheistic themes, e.g. in The Green Man, and in the Anti-Death League. A number of speculative fiction works present a dystheistic perspective, at least as far back as the works of H.P. Lovecraft and Olaf Stapledon's influential philosophical short novel Star Maker. By the 1970s, Harlan Ellison even described dystheism as a bit of a science fiction cliché. Ellison himself has dealt with the theme in his The Death Bird, the title story of Death Bird Stories, a collection based on the theme of malevolent modern-day gods. Lester Del Rey's Evensong tells the story of a fugitive god hunted down across the universe by a vengeful humanity which seeks to put him in his place. Faith of Our Fathers by Philip K. Dick, also from the same anthology, features a horrifying vision of a being, possibly God, who is all-devouring and amoral. Philip Pullman's previously mentioned trilogy, his Dark Materials, presented the theme of a negligent or evil god to a wider audience, as depicted in the 2007 film The Golden Compass based on the first book of this trilogy. Notes: the original series of Star Trek featured episodes with dystheistic themes, amongst them the Squire of Gothos, who mourns for Adonais. For the world is hollow and I have touched the sky, and the return of the Archons. In Encounter at Farpoint, the pilot episode of Star Trek, The Next Generation, Captain Jean-Luc Picard informs Q, a trickster with godlike powers similar to the antagonist in the aforementioned Squire of Gothos episode, that 24th century humans no longer had any need to depend upon or worship god figures. This is an amplification of the tempered anti-theistic sentiment from Who Mourns for Adonais, in which Captain James T. Kirk tells Apollo that mankind has no need for gods, we find the one quite adequate. In Star Trek, Deep Space Nine it is revealed that the Klingon creation myth involves the first Klingons killing the gods that created them because they were more trouble than they were worth. In the film Pitch Black, anti-hero protagonist Richard B. Riddick stated his own belief: think someone could spend half their life in a slam with a horse bit in their mouth and not believe? Think he could start out in some liquor store trash bin with an umbilical cord wrapped around his neck and not believe? Got it all wrong, holy man. I absolutely believe in God, and I absolutely hate the fucker. Robert A. Heinlein's book Job, A Comedy of Justice, which is mostly about religious institutions, ends with an appearance by Yahweh which is far from complimentary. The Aether, a fictional organization from the D&D's Planescape campaign setting, denies the divinity of the setting's deities. They do, however, tend to worship the great unknown in their place. Misotheism is a 2008 album by Belgian black metal band Garoth. Dystheistic sentiment has also made its way into popular music, evincing itself in controversial songs like Dear God by the band XTC and Blasphemous Rumors by Depeche Mode, which tells the story of a teenage girl who attempted suicide, survived, and turned her life over to God, only to be hit by a car, wind up on life support, and eventually die. A good deal of Gary Numan's work, specifically the album Exile, is laden with misotheistic themes. The output of Oscar-winning songwriter/composer Randy Newman also includes several songs expressing dystheistic sentiment, including the ironic He Gives Us All His Love and the more overtly maltheistic God's Song, both from his acclaimed 1972 album Sail Away. In the latter song, Newman bemoans the futility of dealing with God, whose attitude towards humanity he sees as one of contempt and cruelty. The song God Made by Andrew Jackson Jihad proposes dystheism and has an implied hatred for God. More specifically, their song Be Afraid of Jesus is about a vengeful Christ, although this could be a critique of fundamentalist hate speech. God Am by Alice in Chains from their self-titled release has many misotheistic themes about the perceived apathy of God towards the evil in this world. American death metal bands Deicide and Morbid Angel base much of their lyrics around misotheism in name and in concept. Many bands in the black metal genre, such as Mayhem, Emperor, Gorgoroth, and Darkthrone express extreme misotheism in their lyrics and actions, which involved burning down churches during the early 1990s. In 2006, Australian artist Archie Moore created a paper sculpture called Malthism, which was considered for a Telstra Art Award in 2006. The piece was intended as a representation of a church made from pages of the Book of Deuteronomy. And within its text is the endorsement from God to Moses for invasion of other nations. It says that you have the right to invade, take all their resources, kill all the men and make no treaty with them.